The studio lights blazed down on the stage, each one casting a clinical white glare that made even the smallest twitch in a guest's face feel like it was under a magnifying glass. And tonight's episode was already electric, with a kind of nervous energy that neither the producers nor the security team could fully predict. Cameras swooped like hawks over the polished set, the studio audience's eager murmurs, rippling in waves as they recognized the two women seated across from each other at the glossy interview desk. Jasmine Crockett, the unapologetically fiery Congresswoman known for her sharp legal mind and even sharper tongue, and Ivanka Trump, daughter of a former president, and a figure who had mastered the art of public composure. For the first few minutes, the host tried to keep things cordial, asking about policy differences and the state of the nation, but there was an unspoken inevitability that the conversation would turn into a battleground. Ivanka spoke first, her voice low and practiced, brushing off criticism of her family's political record with the kind of ease that came from years in the spotlight. But Jasmine's gaze didn't soften. Her fingers lightly tapped the desk, her mind calculating every word, every opening, every chance to strip away the polished veneer and reveal what she saw as hypocrisy. The air seemed to thicken as Ivanka made a remark about grace and dignity. In public service, subtly implying Jasmine's passionate style was unbecoming. A faint smirk curled at the corners of her mouth, as though she had already won. The audience tensed, some leaning forward, sensing the spark that could ignite into something unforgettable. Jasmine inhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable. And then, in a voice that cut like tempered steel, she began dismantling Ivanka's point piece by piece, pulling in examples from her legal career documented incidents of double standards and a withering comparison between inherited privilege and earned authority. The rhythm of her words built like a rising tide, pulling the audience into her current, and every time Ivanka attempted to interject, Jasmine would calmly but decisively reclaim the floor, her eyes never breaking from the target. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was surgical, the way she placed her phrases so that each landed with maximum precision. At one point she leaned forward, her voice softening into a tone that was more dangerous than a shout. Grace is standing in front of the truth without hiding behind your father's name. Dignity is being accountable for the power you hold, not borrowing it because of the last name you carry. The audience gasped as though they'd collectively been hit with a gust of cold air. The cameras caught Ivanka's blink, just once, but enough to betray a crack in her carefully maintained armor. Somewhere behind the scenes, the producers were exchanging glances, wondering if they'd just captured the viral moment of the year. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She pivoted seamlessly into policy, weaving personal conviction with fact, painting a vivid contrast between public servants who had clawed their way up from the ground and those who had been elevated by family wealth. Every sentence seemed to tighten a knot in the air until the tension was almost unbearable. And when Jasmine finally paused, the silence was so absolute you could hear the faint hum of the studio equipment. The audience didn't move, didn't breathe. They were waiting for Ivanka's next move. But the longer the pause stretched, the clearer it became that this wasn't just an exchange of words. It was a dismantling in real time, and everyone watching, whether in the studio or at home, could feel it. Ivanka's lips parted slightly, the faintest sign of a counterattack forming, but the words that came out felt unusually slow, as if her mind was wrestling with how to regain control of a conversation that had so suddenly tilted in Jasmine's favor. She tried to pivot, to frame herself as someone who had worked hard despite her privilege, leaning on stories of long nights, intense negotiations, and high-profile projects she had overseen. But even as she spoke, there was a subtle shift in the air. The audience was no longer simply listening. They were evaluating her with the silent weight of Jasmine's critiques still ringing in their ears. The host, sensing an opportunity for ratings gold, leaned back and gave the women room to duel without interruption, his eyes flicking between them like a referee waiting to see if the next blow would be verbal or emotional. Jasmine didn't rush. She allowed Ivanka's words to spill into the room, and when there was the faintest crack of vulnerability, a mention of having to defend her family's legacy, Jasmine struck again. But this time, with a quiet intensity. That made the room almost eerily still. Defending a legacy is easy when the legacy has always been built to protect you, she said, her voice low but sharp, each syllable deliberate. Some of us had to fight for legacies that didn't exist until we made them. That's the difference between inheriting a platform and earning one. The audience's collective intake of breath was audible enough to be picked up by the boom mics overhead. Ivanka straightened her posture, perhaps to project authority, perhaps to steel herself against the blow. But the cameras caught her fingers. Tightening slightly on the desk, a sign that Jasmine's words had landed deeper than she wanted to admit. A few murmurs rippled through the front rows, quiet gasps. Faint whispers, but Jasmine didn't let them break her rhythm. She leaned into the weight of the silence, letting it frame her next sentence like a drum roll before a crescendo. The problem isn't that you were born into power, Ivanka, she continued, her tone never rising above conversational. It's that you mistake that for understanding the people who weren't. And when you speak on their behalf, you speak from a tower, not from the ground they walk on. It wasn't just an argument. It was a portrait painted in real time, with each stroke exposing a gulf between lived experiences. The studio audience, diverse in age, background, and political affiliation, reacted in unison, heads nodding, lips pursed in agreement. Even those who had entered the room as Ivanka supporters now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Ivanka attempted to smile, but it faltered, the corners of her mouth twitching in a way that betrayed the strain of holding composure. Behind the glass of the control booth, the show's director barked quick commands to camera operators to zoom in, to capture every flicker of emotion crossing Ivanka's face, because this was the footage that would be replayed endlessly online, clipped into 30-second viral bursts and dissected on every platform from cable news to TikTok. And still, Jasmine wasn't done. She shifted her posture, folding her hands loosely in front of her. And in a tone that somehow blended warmth with unflinching truth, she added, "You see, when you've been told all your life that the world will bend for you, you never learn how to stand against it. Some of us learned to stand before we could even walk." Was a line that didn't just land. It echoed, bouncing off the walls of the studio and settling into the minds of everyone present. The applause that followed wasn't the polite kind. Meant to fill dead air, it was visceral, involuntary, rising from the seats like a wave that carried with it both admiration and awe. Even the host, whose job was to remain neutral, gave a faint nod of acknowledgement. And in that moment, Ivanka's face told the whole story. She knew she had just been outmatched. Not by volume or aggression, but by the kind of truth that leaves no room for rebuttal. If the first two exchanges had been verbal chess, what followed next was the equivalent of a queen's gambit, sudden, bold, and impossible to ignore. Ivanka, perhaps sensing that the tide had turned so far against her that maintaining her usual detached poise would read as weakness, decided to fight fire with fire. Her voice grew sharper as she leaned forward, challenging Jasmine's record in Congress, pointing to moments where Crockett's votes had stirred controversy and even questioning her motives, suggesting that her passion was more about grandstanding for the cameras than genuine public service. The words hung in the air, coated with just enough personal sting to make the audience shift in their seats. It was a calculated risk. Ivanka knew that striking at Jasmine's integrity was dangerous, but could be her only chance to shift the momentum. But Jasmine, rather than bristling or recoiling, actually smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made it clear she had anticipated such a tactic from the very beginning. She didn't rush to defend herself. Instead, she let the accusations settle in the air like a storm cloud, and then, with a calm almost unnerving in its steadiness, she began to speak in a tone that was neither defensive nor accusatory, but anchored in something far deeper, lived truth. When you've been told all your life that rooms like this weren't built for you, every time you step into one, it's not for applause, she said, locking eyes with Ivanka in a way that forced her to hold the gaze. It's because someone else who never got the chance is watching. And if you think my job is about performing, then you've already admitted you don't understand why some of us serve. The studio audience reacted with a low rumble of approval, a wave of murmured agreement that swelled into claps, but Jasmine didn't pause to soak it in. She began recounting moments from her district, meeting mothers who had lost sons to systemic failures, walking through neighborhoods where boarded-up schools stood as silent monuments to neglect, and sitting with small business owners who had watched generations of work be erased in months. Each story wasn't just an answer to Ivanka's jab, it was a living, breathing counterargument that made her criticism feel hollow by comparison. "The cameras will go away after tonight," Jasmine continued, her voice tightening with controlled emotion. "Those mothers will still be burying their sons. Those schools will still be empty, and those businesses will still be gone. So when I speak here, I'm speaking for them, and I won't apologize if my voice carries further than your comfort zone." The audience erupted, not just in applause, but in something closer to a standing ovation, the kind that drowns out any attempt at interruption. Ivanka's jaw tightened, her composure fraying just slightly at the edges, and the host leaned forward as if to mediate, but even he seemed to sense that the gravity of the exchange made interference pointless. Jasmine, however, wasn't gloating. Her expression remained steady, almost solemn, as if she understood the weight of the moment, not just for her own reputation, but for every person who had ever been told to stay quiet in the presence of inherited power. Then came the line that would later dominate headlines. "The difference between you and me, Ivanka, is that when I speak, I'm not protecting my father, I'm protecting my people." The words landed like a gavel strike, final and authoritative. The kind of sentence that ends debates because there's nothing left to say. A hush fell over the studio, not because people didn't understand it, but because they understood it too well. In that silence, Ivanka's response, whatever it might have been, was already irrelevant.